Well, it is a little bit after 2, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone for coming for this presentation covering our research project looking at advanced driver assistance systems in near crashes, crashes, and crash investigations. I'm Michelle Reyes. I am a senior research associate at the Driving Safety Research Institute at the University of Iowa.
And I am Cheryl Rowe. I am the AV Transportation and Outreach Specialist at the Driving Safety Research Institute.
So to get started today, we want to acknowledge the sponsors and advisors who supported this research. This project was funded by the Federal Highway Administration and the Departments of Transportation in Iowa and Colorado. In addition to our liaisons from these two DOTs, a number of individuals from the Iowa DOT, Iowa and Colorado State Patrols, the Plymouth County Sheriff's Office in Iowa, and the Iowa State University served on our technical advisory committee. So we want to say thank you to all these organizations and individuals for your support and guidance. We'd also like to note that the opinions, findings, and conclusions expressed in this presentation are Cheryl's and mine, and not necessarily those of the Iowa DOT, the Colorado DOT, or the Federal Highway Administration. So over the last decade or so, more and more new vehicles have been equipped with advanced driver assistance systems, or ADAS. These systems can provide warnings, collision avoidance, or sustained driving control assistance. Though numerous published research studies have shown that vehicles equipped with ADAS have lower rates of collision and injury insurance claims, surveys have also shown that a significant proportion of ADAS users are unaware or misinformed about their technologies and how they work. Placing too much trust in an ADAS may contribute to crashes, while a correct understanding may prevent or mitigate them. Unfortunately, today's crash reporting systems are not well situated for studying how driver understanding of ADAS can affect crashes. So this project aimed to help address this gap in knowledge by interviewing and surveying motorists who have been involved in crashes and near crashes. They told us about the ADAS on their vehicles and how they behaved during the incidents. We also surveyed and interviewed law enforcement officers to explore what they understand about ADAS and how that understanding, in fact, affects the way they investigate crashes. We completed qualitative data analysis, examining the interview transcripts and survey responses for themes associated with topics like the purchase, learning, and expectations of ADAS and their use of ADAS. Today, we'll share some of the highlights of this research project, including some recommendations for stakeholders.
So we all know there are lots of different types of ADAS technologies out there in vehicles today. We chose to focus on 9 different ADAS technologies. We selected 3 collision warnings, blind spot monitor warning, forward collision warning, and lane departure warning. We chose 3 collision interventions, automatic emergency braking, automatic emergency steering, and lane keeping assistance. We also chose 3 driving control assistance ADAS, adaptive cruise control, lane centering assist, and active driving assist. We chose these and so that people would be able to correctly identify what was on their vehicle. We did actually include the name and the description that you see on the screen, which came from clearing the confusion, so that they could read the descriptions to provide us a better understanding of whether or not they had it on their vehicle. We are going to attempt to use the names throughout our presentation today, but I do want to draw your attention to the acronyms as they may come out of our mouths by accident. So the plan that we had for our motorists was to identify motorists through recruitment, either through email. We have an email for the University of Iowa where there's a mass email system, and we also have a list of email people in our registry here at our facility. We also put postings on social media, and we also identified people through letters that were sent from the DOT. So we identified people through the DOT data, and then they provided the letters that were then mailed to the participants. All of these methods directed people to a survey. The survey was completed. At the end of the survey, we asked people if they were interested in participating in the interviews. At that time, we then took over and we identified our candidates. We wanted to make sure we had a diverse sample based on their demographics, the crash details, as well as the different ADAS features. We conducted the interviews virtually via Teams. These were recorded and they were transcribed at the time of the interview. After the interviews were complete, we had intended to retrieve the crash data for the specific crashes that we had talked to motorists about, so that we could then identify the investigating officer who would then also be interviewed. Unfortunately, we were not able to do these two steps because very early on, we identified that it was going to be somewhat of a challenge, if at all possible, to access the crash data in Colorado. And there was also going to be some issues with keeping the information confidential between the officer and the motorist. Our survey was divided into several topic areas. These were the inclusion, the crash details, different ADAS information about the vehicle, as well as whether or not they were interested in the interviews. There was logic built into the survey so that people would stop if they did not meet the inclusion criteria. There was also logic built into it so that certain ADAS features would be prioritized related to the type of crash. I do just want to point out that we did identify definitions for both a crash and a near crash. We identified a crash as a collision with another vehicle, departing the road, or striking an object other than an animal. And a near crash was defined as a time you or another person may have taken evasive action to avoid a collision with another vehicle or object, or to avoid a road departure. In preparation for our interviews, we obtained the orders manual and reviewed the subject survey's responses to try to identify which ADAS features may be present on the vehicle and which ADAS may or may not have been used at the time of the incident. This helped our team identify which ADAS to focus on during the interview. We had an interview guide, which we had designed prior to the study to help us guide where we would go with the topics. Not every interview is conducted in the exact same order because the interviews would take different paths. But we tried to hit on all of the topic areas that you see on the screen: ADAS education, how did they understand the vehicle, and what kind of role did the ADAS play at the time of the incident? Did they change their behavior? Did it have some sort of impact on the outcome? And during the interviews, we actually attempted to use the different terms that the interviewees would use to describe their systems, just so that it would keep away from getting them confused. The law enforcement data collection took a very similar route as the motorist. The only real difference is they were asked to either complete the survey or the interview up front. And this was a recommendation that our technical advisory committee had made to try to increase participation. It was thought that it might be challenging to get officers to spend, time away from their jobs to give us the interviews. The officer survey and the interviews covered the same topics, including their approach to conducting crash investigations, their approach to ascertaining the role of the technologies had played into either contributing or mitigating a crash, how the officers decide when to include ADAS in a crash report, and information related to training on their ADAS technologies and their understanding of the technologies in the vehicles. So I'm going to kind of just transfer now into some some findings related to the motorists. We had a total of 260 people accessed the survey. Unfortunately, only 69 completed. 29 were found to be ineligible either for age, not having ADAS on their vehicle, or for having a crash or an incident that may have occurred, say, in a parking lot or when they were backing. Why others stopped, we really don't know. It could be that there was no payment with the survey. That's just my guess. Or maybe they just didn't want to take the time to fill out the survey. Our sample was predominantly white, and over 2/3 of them had a bachelor's degree. About 40% of those interested in the interview were invited, and about 40% of them scheduled and then completed the interview. The most common incident type and the most common crash type were the front to rear incidents, followed by front to side, and no other vehicles involved. The majority of the no other vehicles involved were instances of a driver leaving the road. Not a surprise that many of the incidents occurred during daylight, dry, and clear conditions. When the conditions tended to deteriorate, those often resulted in a crash, not a near crash. And speeds mostly the incidents occurred at 55 or at 35. And considering the types of vehicles, it was somewhat uniform for vehicle year, ranging anywhere between 2013 and 2023. Most common vehicle makes were Toyota, followed by Subaru, Ford, and Chevy. When we did kind of dig into which ADAS are most frequently equipped on the vehicles as identified by a motorist, ACC was the most often identified, followed by the warning type ADAS. It's really no surprise, I don't think, that automatic emergency braking was the least equipped, and it was also the most widely identified as being unsure if it was on their vehicle. I think what is interesting, it's not shown on the slide here, is that ACC was identified as being equipped. However, there was also the most people that were unsure if it was active at the time of the incident. And I think that's interesting because ACC is generally an ADAS feature that you have to physically activate by pressing a button.
So I'm going to start talking about some of the themes that we found in our motorist data. We observed a wide variety of motorist understanding of ADAS. We interviewed motorists who had a solid understanding of their ADAS features and others who were mistaken about either what systems they had or what the systems on their vehicle did. As Sherry mentioned, motorists used a multitude of different names or terms to describe the systems on their car. And as she said, some of them just described kind of what they did, which made the interviews a little bit challenging because, as she said, we tried to use the kind of the same wording and terminology that they did. So for example, one motorist was describing their blind spot warning system as on the rear view mirror, there's a light that flashes if there's a car that's too close, things like that. Several motorists that we interviewed seemed to conflate or blend different ADAS features together. At least 3 people that we spoke with seemed to describe functions that are performed by forward collision warning systems. They described those as an extension or as part of their adaptive cruise control systems. Another theme concerns the motorist's self-rated understanding. On a scale from 1 to 5, we asked them to rate their understanding, and most people told us that they had an understanding level of 4 or 5 out of 5. But several of those people that gave a high rating then told us that they didn't know where the sensors were located on their vehicle or how those systems worked. We did have several people who described their forward collision warning alarms as being too sensitive. And when we asked them to explain what they meant by that, they described situations where they had received alerts that they felt were unnecessary, often because they were paying attention and saw what was happening. And even though people described these situations, they did seem to be used to getting them and told us they weren't interested in disabling those forward collision warning systems. So that's a good sign. And though the motorists we talked to generally saw ADAS as being helpers or assistants, one even described it as a security blanket, especially as they got older. There were some that acknowledged, yeah, I do rely on it too much, especially when it came to blind spot warning. We had another set of themes that were kind of related to how people learned about the ADAS on their vehicles. Most of the motorists that we spoke to in the interviews purchased their vehicle new from a dealership, and they described a variety of experiences. Could you go back one, please, Sherry?
Sorry.
No, you're okay. They described a variety of experiences at the dealership. Some of them said that the ADAS were only mentioned kind of in a laundry list of features that the salesperson was just running down as they were trying to sell them the car. But on the other end of the spectrum, we had a couple of people that told us that the salespeople they had worked with were really intentional about demonstrating the ADAS. They took them out on the test drive. In one case, the salesperson drove first and had the customers observe them using it, and then they switched places, and then were able to try it out with the salesperson there in the car with them. Very few motorists told us that they had read their owner's manual. One who did said he found it really helpful, and it felt that it had laid out kind of step by step how to use the system that he was trying to learn about. But another one described the owner's manual as horrible, and this individual actually had 3 different owner's manuals for their vehicle. And so he kind of gave up on that and decided that he was going to go watch videos on YouTube instead. When we asked motorists what method of learning they thought was most effective, we heard most about learning by driving the car themselves or getting a demonstration, and watching videos of other people's experience was also mentioned as well. One person that we spoke with who had experienced an automatic emergency braking during their incident told us that when she had purchased the vehicle, the salesperson had tried to describe how abrupt that braking experience would be. And even though she was still startled during the incident, she really appreciated that that person had tried to explain that and kind of forewarn her. Another motorist who experienced a similar event told us, unprompted, that he wished his salesperson had kind of told him about that so he could have been a little bit more prepared for that really startling experience. And then I've just got kind of a collection of a few other themes that we identified. Several of the people that we interviewed either share a vehicle with a partner or a spouse, or they were using their spouse's primary vehicle when the incident occurred. In one single vehicle household, the participant told us that their spouse had identified candidate vehicles for purchase, and then they went and drove them together. But that person told us that I don't need all these bells and whistles. I just need conventional cruise control and I'm happy. Whereas those features were important to her spouse. Other interviewees referenced having different opinions or preferences from their spouses when it came to using or disabling ADAS. 2 people told us that their spouse had turned off the lane departure warning or lane keep assist feature, and then they just kept it off. And so they noted, oh, they went and drove the vehicle and they're not getting alerts anymore. And that's how they kind of figured out that it had been turned off. Other people shared that their partners or spouses had really strong opinions about those systems. And so maybe that was kind of to keep the peace in the household. And this kind of echoed what we saw in the motorist survey data as well, that lane features were the systems that people were most likely to have disabled. And finally, I want to touch on 2 motorists that had really significant misunderstandings of how the ADAS on their vehicle worked. And unfortunately, both these people experienced crashes, crashes that resulted in injuries and being transported to the hospital. And both of these individuals told us that they intend to no longer use ADAS in their vehicles. So to kind of summarize our findings for the motorist portion of this project, we want to share the role that ADAS played in these crashes and near crashes that we interviewed people about. So 2 of these participants were involved in incidents related to a loss of control in icy road conditions. Both of these individuals incorrectly believed that the ADAS on their vehicles would detect and respond to these situations. And in reality, they would not have had any effect. So we're classifying or kind of categorizing these as no effect on the crash or near crash. 2 participants were involved in minor sideswipe crashes. They both said they did not see a blind spot warning in their side mirror, and they both believed that they should have gotten one. However, they also told us that told us things about their blind spot warning systems that were not supported by the information in the owner's manual. So the role of ADAS in these crashes is kind of in a gray zone. We're not really able to tell whether they should have gotten one and they didn't, or it was there and they just didn't see it. And the second driver did hear an audio alert that was related to their proximity sensors. So these are parking sensors located around the vehicle. So the vehicle they made contact with had gotten within range of those sensors and it had alerted them, but they weren't able to avoid making contact. So this orange block represents 2 incidents in which the use of ADAS contributed to the incident, the crash or the near crash. So this first one was a 6-year-old vehicle. This person knew their car very, very well. And it had lots and lots of miles on it as well. And the vehicle activated automatic emergency braking while it was going down the interstate at 70 plus miles per hour alongside a semi and in front of another vehicle. And luckily this driver was able to avoid striking any other vehicle and being struck from behind, but that would have been that near crash would have been potentially catastrophic if it had played out. In the other situation highlighted in this orange block, there was a driver who was using active driving assistance. So that is, she's using adaptive cruise control to control the speed and also had the lane centering active. And they described the ADAS failing to detect a lane departure and then the automation overcorrecting as the driver fought with the vehicle for control of the steering wheel before ultimately experiencing a road departure with a rollover. So also a very sort of scary situation. And we're not able to tell from that one whether it was actually a malfunction or just the driver misunderstanding and maybe there's a little bit of panic involved in that. And half the participants we spoke with felt the ADAS in their vehicle had a positive effect on their incident. 2 fully credited automatic emergency braking with preventing a front to rear collision, and 2 more believed that their forward collision warning or possibly their automatic emergency braking, they weren't sure if that had activated or not, likely helped avoid a front to rear collision. And finally, there was an activation of blind spot warning and proximity sensors that may have helped avoid a sideswipe crash in a roundabout. So I'll turn over to Sherry now to move into the findings related to our officer portion of this project.
So we had 66 officers complete our survey. And only 5 of them indicated receiving any sort of ADAS related training. And 3 of those were in an informal way. So maybe just getting it on their own or at a conference or something. We then asked them to identify how often they might consider ADAS in a crash investigation. 42% said they never consider it. And the reasons for not considering it often were related to a lack of training or awareness, or I just don't know how to. They also mentioned several times that it doesn't matter, it's the driver's responsibility. And They also just don't know how to investigate these types of crashes. They often refer to, we have to call a TI, a technical investigator, or a crash reconstructionist to get into those types of situations. Now, for those that did indicate if they considered ADAS in crashes, we asked them to provide the circumstances to when they would consider it. And the most common thing mentioned was the driver told me that the vehicle had an ADAS feature, or they maybe said the light went off. Another thing that was commonly mentioned was the vehicle model and year. So where do the officers go when they are trying to figure out whether ADAS is on a vehicle or may have been involved in a crash? They mostly identified going to the event data recorder data. And other options were looking up the VIN, owner's manuals, or several mentioned different types of sources, such as dealerships, mechanics, the NHTSA website, and doing other types of online searches or YouTube, searching for YouTube guides. Now, we were interested in whether or not officers would want training and would it be effective for them. More than 80% of our officers indicated they would want training and agreed that training about ADAS would enhance their ability to effectively investigate crashes. But how do they want that training? The majority of them indicated that they would like it to be an in-person class, but also that it would be important to have materials as references to go along with those classes, to go along with the in-person class. I will say from our interviewees, they also said they understand that in-person classes may not be feasible due to the time and the expense, but it was stressed often that in-person classes would be the most beneficial.
So some of the thoughts shared by the officers in the interviews echoed those we heard from the motorist. We again observed a wide range of knowledge and understanding about ADAS. Several officers admitted that they were not familiar with ADAS. Some Googled it before participating in the study. Some of the officers had very incorrect ideas of ADAS. One thought that that term referred to the infotainment system inside vehicles. Several others mentioned self-driving cars. We again heard things about not knowing how the ADAS work, how they get the data from sensors or cameras. Several officers mentioned kind of a learning curve, whether that was ADAS on a personal vehicle or within their work vehicle. They again observed that motorists are, from their perspective, over-relying on these systems, and several of them mentioned personally experiencing nuisance alarms with forward collision warning or getting a warning when the sensors on their patrol vehicle got covered by ice and snow, and that being kind of alarming situation for them. We also heard a number of things related to why officers don't consider ADAS or why they feel like they cannot. So there is this perception among officers that they need special equipment or specialized training like technical accident investigation training in order to consider ADAS when they're on the scene of a crash. Several of them mentioned not being able to download the data from the vehicle. So there's kind of this perception that you need to have the data. And I just would like to point out that there's lots of things officers make determinations about when they do crash investigations where they're not getting data, like hard data from a braking system or even a camera or of some type, or going to the airbag module to try to figure out if someone's wearing their seatbelt or not, even in a severe injury crash. We also heard loud and clear from officers that their resources are limited and the use of ADAS in a crash doesn't change the outcome from their perspective. So if ultimately, even if the car gave a warning or did braking or whatever it would be, it's still the driver's responsibility. They weren't paying enough attention, and that's why the system activated, and so it's still on them. They also have investigated crashes where there were intentional acts on the driver's part. They're driving impaired, they're driving at a high rate of speed. And so ADAS wouldn't have an impact in those situations, according from their perspective. And again, like we've heard, they've not gotten training or guidance, and we heard more than once, it's not on the crash report form, so I don't think about it. We saw firsthand as we prepared to interview our motorists how difficult it was to verify which ADAS features are on a vehicle. If anyone's looked at their owner's manual, you probably will see the term if equipped over and over and over. So you get one manual for all levels of trim for a model, and it doesn't lay out this trim level has this system and so forth. So we did obtain the VIN from most of the motorists in order to try to identify that and to prepare for our interviews. But even then, it was really difficult. Sometimes what you get is not complete. We were looking at dealership websites or review websites trying to ascertain which systems were on which car. And it wasn't just us. The technical accident investigators that we interviewed also described difficulty, even with their training and equipment. Uh, the equipment to get data off the EDR has to be make specific. And there is not, unlike the airbag module data that they download, there is not standardization for the data related to ADAS. And so if they are able to retrieve data, it's kind of a learning curve and a learning process of trying to interpret that for each car that they access. We heard a lot about Teslas in our conversations. The Colorado crash report includes a couple of fields related to autonomous driving and to automation. And the officers in Colorado are to indicate on the report what level of assistance or automation the vehicle had, and these correspond to the SAE levels of automation. There's a lot of confusion when we talk to officers. Well, what's the difference between this level and this level? They're not able to tell us. And one officer from Colorado said that they code pretty much every Tesla crash as full automation, which is the highest level, level 5 automation. And they said they do that even if the driver wasn't using the autopilot at the time of that incident. There's another field in the Colorado report of driver-seated control of vehicle, and there's also some confusion about that. That field's not intended to apply to driver assistance or partial automation, and I think there's some clearing of the confusion that could be done with that. But regardless, any officer that we talk to, we ask them about whether they've ever investigated a crash involving autonomous vehicles. Just about every one of them mentioned a Tesla. They would say, no, I haven't, because I haven't had a Tesla yet, or something to that effect. And so there's this misperception that ADAS equals automation, or that Teslas equal autonomous, those types of ideas.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how the officers identified whether or not ADAS may have played a role in the crash. So looking at the survey respondents and the interviews, we were able to identify about 8 instances where they thought ADAS may have mitigated the severity of a crash. And the majority of these times it involved FCW, which is forward collision warning, or automated emergency braking. The other one included StabiliTrak, which wasn't part of our study, so that's why it's not on the slide. There were also officers who identified situations where ADAS may have contributed to the crash. Again, the emergency braking played a role in some of these situations. For example, the brake assist went off maybe when it wasn't necessary, and then caused a collision behind those particular vehicles. There were also instances where officers identified motorists over relying on systems like blind spot monitor warning, the lane assist, and the Tesla autopilot. There was also an officer who identified that motorists can sometimes be distracted by an alarm or a light. Some other interesting things that came out of some of the interviews was that they were identifying that an ADAS can't help in a situation where it's, it's too little, too late. You're going too fast, can't respond in time. It just can't really change the severity of a crash. And there were also a couple of officers who identified, I wonder how many fender benders are being avoided or aren't being reported, or how many impaired drivers aren't weaving in the road because of ADAS and thus being stopped by officers.
All right, so we're going to wrap up our presentation with some recommendations for different stakeholder groups. So starting off with departments of transportation and infrastructure owner operators. Really, as far as ADAS goes, making sure that lane markings are bright and high contrast. Lots of jurisdictions are implementing those wider lane markings. We did have one participant who thought in the area where their incident occurred, there was the pavement marking was right at the edge, the very edge of the pavement. And they wondered if maybe it would be better to have the lane marking moved in a little bit so that there would be a little bit of pavement to operate on past the lane marking. Also, in some of the descriptions that the officers who participated in the survey told us about situations where they were using lane keeping assistance and went through an intersection or a curve that where the lane boundary had been lost. So infrastructure owner operators can consider continuing those lane pavements through on ramps and off ramps and through intersections. And we also heard a number of people tell us that of motorists telling us that their systems pick up on tar lines for roadwork repairs, or maybe there's a place where there's been road construction and they've removed the lane markings, but they're still getting picked up by their system. So when you are doing maintenance or road construction, doing the best you can to get a clean removal of those lane lines. Departments of transportation who are doing licensing and driver training might consider providing drivers with general training on ADAS, maybe as part of the licensure process or renewal process, or possibly integrating that into the vehicle registration system. And so you'd be able to inform those owners what's on their car, and you might also be able to then integrate that into your vehicle registration system so that when an officer encounters one of these vehicles, perhaps when they pull the VIN and pull the vehicle registration, it could give them a list of features that are on the car as well. So when it comes to manufacturers, kind of in that same vein, making it easier for motorists and officers to know what's on the car. We had a technical accident investigator tell us about a special make code that they try to access to figure out which modules actually got put into the car as far as where they can retrieve data from. And so if there was a way for anyone to put in their VIN or to scan a VIN or another QR code on the vehicle and get just a list that is clear of what was actually put into that vehicle when it was built. Beyond that, using common naming across different manufacturers, providing more online resources and not just relying on the owner's manual as the primary way of educating owners about their ADAS in their car, and making those owner's manuals easier to understand. Implementing some sort of diagnostics on a vehicle that's experienced an ADAS activation. So our participant who had the automatic emergency braking activation or malfunction on the interstate, they took it to the dealership, and the technicians at the dealership were unable to really figure out what had happened. There wasn't any data that they knew how to access on the car to say, well, this is why that triggered. They replaced a cable on her car. They didn't think it really had anything to do with the malfunction. And since the malfunction didn't happen again, they assume that it's been fixed. That makes me personally uncomfortable, but and then as we touched on before, a way to standardize the data that are being recorded from ADAS features so that if that data is downloaded by a technical accident investigator from the EDR, that they're able to readily access and interpret that. We also asked our motorists if they had any recommendations for the designers of their vehicles, and we heard recommendations for blind spot warning and for the lane keeping and lane centering systems. Also, they would really love it if there's a way to keep sensors from getting covered by ice or snow. I'm not so sure with us being in Iowa if that's really a possibility or not, but they would love it. When it comes to the dealerships, we would recommend trying to train or educate the consumers and not just selling the ADAS to them. And even if they have a buyer who's not particularly interested in the ADAS, finding a way to get that information to them, maybe framing it as I want you to have this information so you can make an educated choice about whether or not to use these technologies. Maybe encouraging the sales staff to do these test drives where they actually demonstrate the features and then coach the buyers on how to use them, whether that is before or after the purchase. Potentially having a post-sale check-in a few weeks after the person's taken their car home, see if they have any questions. And maybe even considering having, if you're a big enough dealership or have the resources, identifying a specialist within your business to provide post-sale ADAS information. And we'll put the caveat in there. We had very few people who got their vehicles either secondhand, not as the original owner, or is in a private party sale. And so we don't have recommendations for other ways of getting information to those buyers, but it is very important. And we actually are involved in other research projects looking at how best to do that. As far as law enforcement agencies go, we do recommend implementing some sort of training where you do some general education on ADAS. As Sherry mentioned earlier, they would prefer this to be in person with real life demonstrations. Another suggestion we heard is including it in the annual in-service. If you're not doing it in person, kind of the recommended length of time for a virtual experience was about 30 minutes. Again, this should be just very general and provide guidance about what officers can ask drivers and help them understand what type of systems are related to which crash type. And it could be something very simple like this, just a kind of a question guide of things of ways you can broach the topic of systems or get kind of an in. You can just say, I noticed the camera, what's the camera do? Pretend to be curious. Things like that. So when we say we recommend training, this is kind of what we're talking about, this high level, just increasing awareness that these systems are out there and what they do. When it comes to crash reporting, our recommendation would be to proceed slowly and proceed thoughtfully, and be sure to include officers in the process if you're going to make an update to a crash report form. It's very important that these fields are very clear and very easy to fill out, because if they're not, the officer will just indicate unknown, and then you get kind of a garbage in, garbage out sort of situation. We did have one interviewee suggest Carfax for police as a potential information source for what might be on a vehicle. As far as ADAS, we have not been able to verify that, but it's kind of intriguing because that may be a fairly simple way for officers who have access to that to obtain that information. So just to summarize here, as we all know, ADAS are here and they are prevalent. They are being involved in crashes. Motorists and officers have a broad spectrum of understanding when it comes to ADAS. They may not be aware of what's on their car or what they do. They misunderstand or over rely on them. And we have seen evidence both here and in other research that these systems can help reduce crashes and mitigate severity. But we've also seen that if you don't understand what these systems do, and what their limitations are, that can contribute to crashes. So it's really critical that consumers and officers are better educated about these systems. Officers told us that they feel they would benefit from ADAS training, and we just talked about some of the things that that could achieve. Really driving home the point that ADAS is not autonomous driving, and for motorists and officers, the driver is responsible for the operation of the vehicle. It needs to be a lot easier for everyone to figure out what ADAS are on a vehicle. And if a jurisdiction is going to change their crash report form, that needs to be done very thoughtfully, and it needs to be really easy for the officer to get the information they need to complete that. So that covers everything that we plan to talk about today. We have one question in the chat from Larry. Maybe you covered this, but what ADAS are becoming mandatory for manufacturers being required in the future? So the one that I am certain of is that automatic emergency braking is going to become required. However, the manufacturers have had a voluntary agreement in place for quite some time. So virtually nearly every new car that's sold in the US has automatic emergency braking now. I know we have lots of NHTSA partners on here, so if anyone wants to chime in with additional information on that, we'd love for this to be a discussion and not just a Q&A. So Ashley asks any next steps that we can share. And I don't know if Heather wants to jump in. So Heather Pickering-Hilgers is our liaison from CDOT. So I want to speak for her if she's got something to share. Sherry, do you have any thoughts on next steps?
I think there's opportunities for us to maybe explore, is it feasible to put ADAS into the car registration? What would that take for a DOT to do that? Or I think when I think about it is how can we develop a training for the officers? To me, the next steps would be trying to implement some of our recommendations. I think we've developed a survey and the interview to a point where it could be, with some slight modifications, could be like distributed more widely to people in other states to try to get more information about people's understanding. I definitely think we have a lot that we've learned. We couldn't all fit it into 45 minutes. So
yeah, I think when as far as lessons learned, one thing that I was surprised by was how beneficial it was to do the interviews. So initially we had thought, well, we'll do interviews, or maybe we should just come up with a good survey, and then we can talk to more people, access more people through a survey. But the quality or the qualitative information that we got out of these interviews was really great, and not something that I think would be possible to get out of a survey. Even as Sherry and I went through these survey responses and tried to identify candidates for the interview, trying to interpret what the person wrote in as the description of the crash. And we literally had little cars that we were trying to kind of map out a diagram of what we thought had happened in the crash. And so it's just really hard without having that two-way communication to get really good information on these themes. We're just waiting to see if anyone else, and you could raise your hand and unmute and ask your question live if you'd like. Okay, going once. Going twice. Right. Well, seeing as how there are no more questions, we thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy days to come and listen about our research project. If you have any questions for us, our email addresses are up there. Feel free to reach out at any time with any questions or comments, ideas, or feedback. Otherwise, we hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.